Procedural generation is often one of the major aspects providing the variance and replayability that roguelites have made use of for over 20 to 30 years now. But a game that we played on stream that also used it brought up this interesting conversation about when does it help and when does it hurt a game. So for today's critical thought, we're going to be discussing at what points should you consider having proc gen for your specific title. Procedural generation, or proc gen for short, is a major part of roguelike design and will be discussed heavily in my upcoming book, Game Design Deep Dive Roguelikes. But it is a concept that it's not so much a on or off, but it's different degrees of it that can be used in a game to enhance it. On the quote-unquote small scale, we could say simply shuffling up what rooms, or stitching rooms together, that will create a level. We go a step further and decide what enemies or creating unique enemies or situations, loot tables, and of course, extreme example will be just a completely procedurally generated game, which oftentimes leads to a chaotic madness or effect. But knowing when or how much procedural generation to make use of in title is a very tricky point. It was discussed in Procedural Generation and Game Design by Tanya Short as procedural generation is a great way to ruin your game's design. And that is often a very big misconception that people will have. That simply randomly or procedurally generate your game space automatically makes it better. And that's not how it works. Good procedural generation is built on a foundation that you're going to build your algorithm on that will dictate how the game decides what to put together, what aspects work, and tries to present that feeling of a handmade world when obviously it's not. And many games try to excel to that point, and very few have succeeded. So the footage you're seeing in the upper left is from Chasm. This is a Metroidvania that, if just by looking at those screenshots alone, you probably wouldn't think that is a procedurally generated game. But it is. The game procedurally generates the world and the general layout on every new game. And it kind of took a lot of us when we were playing this for a loop. Now, at this time of recording, we have not finished the game yet. We're going to try to do that on stream. But afterwards, I'm going to reload it because I want to see just how far the proc gen goes. But with a game like this, the procedural generation is designed, again, to mix up the layouts, present a different path through. And on paper, that sounds like it would be a really great idea. It would give this game a lot more replayability. Or as many developers like to say, infinite replayability. But the problem is that procedural generation is much like a tool or like a spice. That you have to be very careful how you use it, and too much can easily wreck whatever your project intends to be. Now, with Chasm, the game still has a linear flow to it. Because it's a Metroidvania, you need specific items. You need item A to get over here, which will then get you item B to be used over here, go back over here for item C, and you get the picture. So, because of that, there is still a linear path through, and this is an often major issue that developers run into when they implement procedural generation. That shuffling up elements in your game does not create variance. It's simply just delaying or lengthening how long it takes a player to make progress. If I need items A, B, C, and D in order to progress through the game, then it doesn't matter how you shuffle the map, what kind of generation you use. I still need those items. Nothing else really matters. This is a common issue that I have with trying to play survival-based games, like Don't Starve, Oxygen Not Included, and the other many examples of it on Steam. That you can procedurally generate the world as many times as you want. You can just close your eyes and hit the randomized seed button a million times. It's still not changing the moment-to-moment gameplay. If I need to cut down a tree to get wood to build an axe to then mine, or to then get a pickaxe and then mine the ground to get stone, however you want procedural generated is not changing that fact. And this is often why these games tend to lose me, despite the fact that their worlds are randomly or procedurally generated, is that if the steps that need to be done are repeated each time, then the experience does not provide variance. A game like Hades, for instance, its procedural generation is not that advanced, or not as advanced as some of the other roguelike or roguelite examples that we've seen. Simply, it shovels around handmade rooms, and then the game will randomly choose what boons to attach to the rewards of said rooms. But that is enough to generate variance, because the moment-to-moment aspect of playing Hades changes each time we play it. Do I get Ares boon? Do I get Poseidon? Is this going to be an elite fight? Is it going to just be a shop? All those little decisions, they may not sound like a lot or sound as big as something like in Chasm, but it's affecting the game in very specific ways to generate that variance. And ultimately, that's what you want procedural and random generation to do. Each time I play the game, I should feel like the experience is different. I feel like my strategies have to change or adapt to what's going on. With a game like Chasm, however, it really isn't. And again, at this point, I don't know the extent that the procedural generation is affecting things. But I'm still assuming that from a progression standpoint, I still need to collect the same items or the same kind of movement enhancers each time I play. And one of the things I did notice is that they do essentially split each biome into kind of the areas I can access before I get the item, the areas I can access after, and you'll see that there's stronger and different enemies in that back half. And again, that's just good procedural generation. You need to set a foundation for your algorithm. But here's the big point. In a roguelike or a typical procedurally generated game, we're dealing with runs that are between, let's say safely, 30 minutes to an hour, give or take. Biome Isaac, Enter the Gungeon, Hades, and so many other roguelikes I'm forgetting off the top of my head. Chasm, we've been playing it for about 3 hours now, and we're only 77% done. I figure one more night stream and we'll be done the game. But again, that's a lot of weight to tie into a procedurally generated system. And most people who play games that have a fixed end, that is, you beat the game, you see the final boss, it's game over, you're done, congratulations, you're not going to be replaying that game. Normally, with a game like Chasm, that's 3 hours long, you're not going to be replaying that game again and again, and more importantly, you're not really going to see that same level of variance that we expect from a roguelike or a normal game that's built on variance. So, with that said, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk about a game that has a very similar design aspect to Chasm, but I think handles this roguelike or procedural generation better, and why it is also better suited to make use of proc gen in the first place. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. So, this is footage from a robot named Fight, and this is a Metroidvania-style roguelike that it's a really great example of how procedural generation creates variance and sets up that foundation for multiple runs. So, what you just saw was me picking up the hover boots, and that obviously allows me to fly. Now, in this game, the procedural generation has a very set foundation to how it generates each run. You're going to move through 4 biomes. The 4 biomes are set up in a very loose organization. You're still going to go from 1 to 4. In each biome, there are going to be walls or obstacles that will require a specific upgrade. Maybe a door that needs to be shot with a firebolt. Maybe some section that needs to be float, or we have to roll like in a Samus ball to get around. When the game decides or creates the run, it will go through and pick what items it will kind of sprinkle throughout the play, and then it will choose the obstacles accordingly. So that if I need, let's say, a fire-based item, then a fire item is going to spawn. If I don't, then chances are it's going to spawn something else. The different movement tech that will show up in a run also will determine what your strategies are. Just like a hover boots here, in one run I could get infinite jump. In another run I get reverse gravity powers. And what ends up happening, again, is that, yes, my path through this game is going to be consistent run to run. What happens in said run is going to be vastly different. What passive upgrades that I find are also going to be randomly chosen. So I don't know in this run if I'm going to get a lot of health upgrades. Maybe I'll get a lot of attack speed upgrades, but very few damage upgrades. And again, it's kept very measured. I know what this game is going to be like each time I play it. But by providing those little tweaks in terms of the procedural generation, it creates a lot of variance. And ultimately, that is what I want to see in terms of procedural generation and roguelike design. That each time I play this game, I am getting a different experience. I'm getting something I'm going to need to adapt to. Now, the issue that Chasm had, again, is that I'm still doing the same thing from run to run. And again, the added weight of the run is an issue. A Robot Named Fight, play-wise, is maybe 40 minutes to an hour, give or take. Not 3+ hours. So that when I die or the run ends, I can jump right back into it. The same can't be said of Chasm, and why you need to be really careful again as to when to use procedural generation versus just hand-making your levels. Now, with A Robot Named Fight, it still has that issue of, I guess, feeling generic from room to room. Again, each room that you see is handmade, but where they're placed is stitched together. And you're never really going to get that personalized or that very, I don't know what word I want to use here, I guess unique feel or handmade touch out of a game that each level or each room is explicitly placed there by a developer. But again, you get more in terms of replayability and variety by going the procedurally generated route. And when you're deciding whether or not to use procedural generation, you need to ultimately understand or figure out for your game, is this a title that people are going to want to replay again and again? This is not to say replay the game when I have spare time or, I have some I want to come back to after a few months. But ultimately, the question you need to answer about whether or not you want to use procedural generation for your game is there enough of a reason for people to come back and replay this game again and again? That is not the same as replaying with a New Game Plus mode, or replaying it because, months have gone by and want to experience it again. This is, can I replay this game again and again? And does procedural generation accommodate for those replayable or repeated runs? With A Robot Named Fight here, the answer is yes. I can keep playing this game and get vastly different experiences. With something like Chasm, unfortunately, I don't think it's there. There's not enough in terms of variance. And again, randomly placing down items doesn't change their use or their functionality. Now, this was a game where each time I play it, there is completely different items that I get that change how I move around. Like with A Robot Named Fight, that would be a different story. But again, there has to be enough difference or enough reason to keep replaying this game. Once I finish Chasm, I am not going to feel like wanting to replay this game to get a different run. And when your game has that issue, if it's a linear story where once you've finished it, there's no reason to come back to it, you don't really need procedural generation, or you shouldn't really need to approach it. Because like we said, good procedural generation is very complicated and very hard to do. And you need to kind of weigh how much it's going to help your game if you decide to go that route. Again, you can try to procedurally generate every aspect of your title, but oftentimes that leads to a confusing mess and may lead to a weaker experience if you would have just decided to do things the handmade route. And it's unfortunately just kind of the nature of this kind of design, that if you're not able to keep the player invested, it doesn't matter if your game can generate a million different versions or a million different runs if it's all still the same thing. And again, for those of you watching this, take a look at games like Hades, or even something like A Robot Named Fight or Dead Cells, where it's not as advanced as some of the examples that we've seen in terms of full-on procedural generation. You can kind of see the seams in how each run is generated. But by applying this in the right places and where it matters most, it makes those games far more enjoyable. Again, another really good example, Slay the Spire and Monster Train. Their foundations are very fixed from run to run. But by just choosing and altering how you get your rewards or what rewards show up, it makes those games infinitely more replayable than they would have been otherwise. And again, the goal of procedural generation in any case is to make the game feel different each time you play it. If I'm still required to do the same things, then it doesn't matter how you shuffle things up. And that's a major point that I talked about in Game Design Deep Dive Roguelike. That many people argue that any random or procedural generation is automatically good, or it automatically will make your game better. But truth be told, that is not the case. And to end this video on, here's the final point. If you're deciding whether or not to use procedural generation or not in your game, you have to be able to say to yourself, does this game feel legitimately different each time I play it? Can I play your game run 1 to run 100 and it's a different experience? If you can say yes, then your procedural generation works. If I'm still doing the same exact thing, just in a different or shuffled order, that doesn't justify procedural generation. And you can see another example game that I've been playing was Cavity, I think it was Cavity Busters, that also does really well and make use of procedural generation. And when this works, and again, this is why a lot of people look at roguelikes or procedural generation today. When it works, these games do a lot with far less. A Robot Named Fight is not the most graphically intensive or aesthetically pleasing game on the market. But because it works so well in terms of procedural generation, a lot of people really love it. And the same goes for Dead Cells, Slay the Spire, Monster Train, Isaac, and so on. But when it doesn't work, it leads to the game feeling worse than it should be, and in many cases, it is just wasted time and development on your title, where you could have done something handmade for far less work, and people wouldn't really care or notice otherwise. Again, how many people who looked at the footage from Chasm or played the game would have guessed that that game was procedurally generated or want to play the game as many times as something like Slay the Spire or Robot Named Fight? But to end this video on my question for you, can you think of games that should have gone the procedurally generated route, and what aspects would have helped them? And can you think of games that should not have gone procedurally generated and would have done better handmade? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to check out our Discord and Patreon link down. And come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design. And come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it. And tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.